Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going exploring the world of Mencius, a Confucian philosopher who's had a huge influence, especially in Chinese thought. Now, you want to understand Mencius's ideas from a philosophical angle, and we're going to do just that, using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him.
I'm excited to dig into this. Mencius is one of those thinkers whose ideas still resonate centuries later. We can learn a lot from how he approached ethics and human nature.
Okay, so let's dive in. Before we get into the specifics of Mencius, maybe you can give us some context. He's considered part of the Confucian tradition, right? What does that actually mean philosophically, especially for someone coming at this from a Western philosophy background?
That's a great place to start. Confucianism is a rich tradition. But if we had to boil it down to some core themes for a philosopher, I'd say there's a focus on reviving ancient traditions to address present problems, leading by example and cultivating your own virtuous character, seeing ritual practices as tied to ethical development, strong emphasis on family relationships as a model for wider social harmony, and of course this idea of constantly striving to become a better person.
That's really helpful. So it sounds like Confucianism is very much concerned with the practical side of ethics, how we actually live a good life.
Absolutely. And it's all situated within the context of ancient China, specifically a chaotic period known as the Warring States period. Imagine constant political upheaval and warfare. This backdrop is crucial for understanding Confucius and Mencius. They were looking for ways to bring order and harmony back to society.
That makes sense. They weren't just theorizing in a vacuum. They were grappling with real-world problems. So where does this idea of virtue fit in? I know it's a big concept in Confucianism.
It is. The ancient Chinese term dai, which we translate as virtue, isn't quite the same as our modern concept of virtue. Think of it as a kind of political charisma that comes from a leader having a truly good character. It was believed that a ruler with this virtue would naturally inspire others and create a flourishing society.
So it's not just about being a good person. It's about having this magnetic quality that draws people towards you and makes them want to follow your lead.
Exactly. And for Confucius, this virtue was rooted in ethical cultivation, constantly working on yourself to become a better person.
Okay, so that's the foundation laid by Confucius. Now, where does Mencius come in? How does he build on these ideas?
Well, Mencius lived about a century after Confucius, and he really developed and expanded on many of these core Confucian themes. What's interesting from a philosophical standpoint is that he wasn't just a scholar writing in isolation. He was actively engaged in trying to influence rulers and policies.
That's intriguing. So he was trying to put philosophy into practice in the real world. What kind of things did he advocate for?
He strongly believed in benevolent governance, ruling with compassion and care for the people. He even got into nitty-gritty policy debates, like proposing a specific tax system called the Wellfield system, aimed at fairness and sustainability.
So not just an armchair philosopher then, but I get the sense he wasn't always successful in swaying those in power.
You're right. It seems he became disillusioned with his attempts to advise rulers, and eventually retired from public life.
It kind of adds a tragic dimension to his story, but it also highlights his commitment to trying to make a real difference. All right, now let's get into the philosophical heart of Mencius. One of the things he's most known for is his idea of the four virtues. Can you break those down for us, especially focusing on what's unique and interesting from a philosopher's perspective?
Absolutely. He identifies four cardinal virtues: benevolence, mondeleoi, righteousness, ia, wisdom, and propriety. What makes Mencius's approach stand out is that he links each of these virtues to a specific emotion. He's basically saying that our feelings are an integral part of being ethical, not something separate or opposed to reason.
That's fascinating. It challenges the traditional Western view that emotions are somehow irrational and need to be controlled by reason.
Exactly. So for example, benevolence, which we might think of as compassion or caring for others, is linked to the feeling of commiseration. This connection suggests that our natural capacity for empathy is the foundation for ethical action.
So it's not just a duty to care for others, but a feeling of genuine concern and connection that drives our benevolent actions.
Precisely. Now righteousness, which involves standing up for what's right and disdaining what's wrong, is tied to the feeling of shame. Mencius is saying that we have an innate sense of what's just and unjust, and when we violate that sense, we experience a feeling of shame.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It suggests that our conscience, that inner voice that tells us right from wrong, is tied to our emotional responses.
And it highlights the importance of cultivating that sense of righteousness, of becoming more attuned to what evokes feelings of shame or indignation.
So we've got benevolence tied to commiseration, righteousness to shame, What about wisdom and propriety? What emotions are they associated with?
For Mencius wisdom, which we might understand as practical intelligence and the ability to make sound judgments, is linked to the emotion of approval and disapproval. So it's not just about knowing facts, but also about having a discerning sense of what is truly valuable and worth pursuing.
So wisdom has this moral dimension to it. It's not just about being clever or strategic.
Exactly. And this ties in with Mencius's idea that wisdom involves knowing when to deviate from ritual. He gives this example of rescuing a drowning sister-in-law. Normally, touching a woman who's not your wife would be considered improper according to Confucian rituals. But in this life or death situation, wisdom dictates that you act to save a life, even if it means bending the rules.
That's a great example. It shows how Mencius was thinking about these virtues in a very nuanced way. What about the last virtue, propriety?
Propriety, which is about respecting social norms and behaving appropriately in different contexts, is connected to the emotion of respect. Mencius saw this as particularly important for maintaining social order and harmony. He believed that following rituals and customs cultivated a sense of deference and respect for others, especially elders and authority figures.
So propriety is like the glue that holds society together. It provides a framework for how we interact with each other in a respectful and harmonious way.
That's a good way to put it. And for a philosopher, this raises interesting questions about the relationship between individual autonomy and social norms. How much should we prioritize conformity to tradition versus individual expression? Mencius clearly saw value in maintaining social order, but as we saw with the sister-in-law example, he also acknowledged that there are times when individual judgment needs to override strict adherence to ritual.
That tension between the individual and society is definitely something that philosophers have grappled with for centuries. It's fascinating to see how Mencius was navigating those same questions back in ancient China. But now I want to get to one of Mencius's most famous and controversial claims. The goodness of human nature. This is a huge topic, so maybe we can break it down. What did he actually mean when he said human nature is good?
Right. This is where things get really interesting from a philosophical perspective. Mencius wasn't saying we're born perfect or that we never do anything wrong. What he meant is that humans have an inherent capacity for goodness, a natural inclination toward the four virtues. It's like we all have these seeds of virtue within us, which he called sprouts, waiting to be nurtured and developed.
So it's more like a potential for goodness rather than a guarantee?
Precisely. He uses the analogy of an orange tree. It's in the nature of an orange tree to bear fruit. But it needs the right conditions, sunlight, water, fertile soil, to flourish and actually produce those oranges. Similarly, human beings have this natural tendency towards goodness, but we need the right environment and the right kind of cultivation to fully realize that potential.
Okay, that's helpful. But I'm guessing not everyone bought into this idea that we're all inherently good. I mean, the world is full of bad stuff happening all the time. How did Mencius account for that if we're all supposed to be so naturally inclined towards virtue?
That's a question that Mencius directly addressed. He argued that wrongdoing doesn't negate the inherent goodness of human nature. Instead, he saw it as a result of not properly cultivating those virtuous sprouts, letting them wither and die, or allowing ourselves to be misled by our senses and desires.
So it's like we have this internal battle going on between our better nature, those virtuous sprouts, and our more base impulses.
You could think of it that way. Our senses and desires can sometimes lead us astray, tempt us with immediate gratification without considering the ethical consequences.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this might play out in real life?
Sure, imagine you see someone drop their wallet on the street. Your immediate impulse might be to keep it, especially if you're in a tough spot financially. That's your desire for self-preservation kicking in. But then your sense of righteousness might kick in, that feeling of shame that Mencius talked about, reminding you that stealing is wrong. And your sense of benevolence might make you think about the distress the person must be feeling at losing their wallet.
So in that moment, you have all these different impulses pulling you in different directions, and it's up to you to decide which one to act on.
Exactly. And Mencius would say that the key to making the right choice is to engage in what he called sai, or reflection. It involves carefully examining our thoughts, feelings, and motivations, and trying to align them with our innate moral sense.
So it's not enough to just have these good impulses. We have to actively cultivate them through self-awareness and conscious effort.
Precisely. Mencius believed that this process of reflection is essential for moral development. He even compares it to learning a complex skill like playing the game of Go. You might have a natural aptitude for it, But you'll never become a master without dedicated practice, careful observation, and constantly analyzing your moves.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights the idea that moral development isn't passive. It requires active engagement and continuous learning. But I'm also thinking about how this relates to the debate in Western philosophy about whether knowledge automatically leads to action. Some philosophers, like Socrates, argued that if we truly know what's right, we'll naturally do it. But others have argued that knowledge and action can be quite separate. Where do you think Mencius would fall on this spectrum?
That's a really insightful question, and it points to a key difference between Confucian thought and some strains of Western philosophy. While Mencius placed a high value on knowledge and understanding, he didn't believe it was sufficient for ethical action. Remember, he emphasized Xingxi this process of reflection and self-cultivation, which suggests that simply knowing the right thing to do isn't enough. We need to actively cultivate the dispositions and habits that allow us to translate knowledge into action.
So it's more about aligning our actions with our knowledge, creating a kind of harmony between what we know and how we live.
Exactly. And I think that's a very powerful idea even for philosophers today. It challenges us to think about ethics not just in terms of abstract principles, but also in terms of embodied practice, of how we cultivate those virtues in our daily lives.
So far, we've been talking about Mencius in relation to Confucius, but I know he wasn't operating in a philosophical vacuum. Were there other thinkers he was engaging with, maybe even debating against?
Oh, absolutely. Mencius was a sharp critic of other philosophical schools that were prominent in his time. He saw some of their ideas as direct threats to the Confucian way of life, which he believed was essential for a just and harmonious society.
That makes sense. If you're convinced that a certain way of thinking is crucial for human flourishing, you're bound to push back against ideas that you see as undermining that vision. Who were some of his main philosophical rivals?
Two of the most prominent were Mozi and Yang Zhu. They represented very different philosophical positions that Mencius felt compelled to argue against.
I've heard those names before, but I could use a refresher. Can you give us a crash course on their philosophies and why Mencius found them so objectionable?
Of course, Mozi was a fascinating figure, often seen as a kind of utilitarian. He advocated for a doctrine of impartial caring, believing that we should extend our concern and compassion equally to everyone, regardless of their relationship to us.
That sounds radical, especially in the context of ancient China where family ties were so central.
It was, and that's precisely why Mencius saw it as such a threat. Remember, Confucianism places a strong emphasis on differentiated caring, the idea that our obligations and affections are strongest towards those closest to us, starting with our family. Mencius believed that Mozi's impartial caring, while well-intentioned, was ultimately impractical and went against our natural inclinations.
I see where the conflict lies. It's like two different visions of how we should structure our ethical relationships. So how did Mencius argue against Mozi's view?
He used a thought experiment that's become quite famous. He asks us to imagine a ruler who's told he should care for his nephew no more than he cares for a random child from the neighborhood. Mencius argues that this goes against our natural instincts and would ultimately weaken the bonds of family and community. He believed that our innate tendency to care more for those close to us is part of what makes us human, and that trying to suppress these feelings would be both unnatural and harmful.
That's a pretty compelling argument. It gets to the heart of what it means to be a human being embedded in a web of relationships. Okay, so that's Mozi. What about Yang Zhu? What was his philosophical beef with Mencius?
Yang Zhu represented a completely different challenge. He's often considered a proponent of ethical egoism, the idea that we should primarily act in our self-interest.
So while Mozi wanted to expand the circle of caring to include everyone equally, Yang Zhu wanted to keep it tightly focused on the individual.
Exactly. And Mencius saw this as a dangerous and destructive philosophy. He believed that a society built on pure self-interest would quickly descend into chaos and conflict. But how do you argue against someone who says, hey, looking out for number one is just human nature?
I can see how that would be a tough argument to counter. What strategy did Mencius use to challenge this view?
Well, he appealed to a different aspect of human nature, one that Yang Zhu seemed to overlook. Remember that famous thought experiment about the child at the well?
You mean the one where someone sees a child about to fall into a well, and their immediate reaction is alarm and a desire to help, even if it means risking their own safety?
That's the one. Mencius uses this scenario to demonstrate that even the most self-centered person has an innate capacity for compassion and concern for others. He argued that this spontaneous feeling of alarm and the urge to help even a stranger show that our nature is not solely driven by self-interest.
It's like he's saying that even if we sometimes act selfishly, there's a deeper part of us that recognizes the suffering of others. and his move to act even if there's no direct benefit to ourselves.
Precisely. And this was a key point for Mencius. He wasn't denying that we have a natural instinct for self-preservation, but he was arguing that Yang Zhu had too narrow a view of human nature. He was ignoring those other aspects of our being that point towards virtue and a concern for the well-being of others.
This is such a rich and complex discussion. It's amazing how these philosophical debates from ancient China are still so relevant to how we think about ethics and human nature today.
I agree. And Mencius's arguments against Mezi and Yang Zhu highlight the enduring tension between these different ethical perspectives, focusing on individual self-interest, prioritizing care for those closest to us, and extending compassion to all beings equally. These are questions that philosophers are still grappling with today, and Mencius's insights offer valuable perspectives on these ongoing debates.
Absolutely. But we've covered a lot of ground already. And I know there's even more to explore in Mencius's thinking. Maybe we can shift gears a bit now and delve into some of the practical implications of his philosophy. You mentioned earlier that Mencius was very interested in putting philosophy into action. How did his ideas about human nature and virtue actually play out in his political philosophy?
That's a great question. Mencius believed that a truly good ruler would embody the four virtues we discussed earlier. He argued that a ruler who cultivated benevolence would naturally care for the people and enact policies that promote their well-being. A ruler who cultivated righteousness would be just and fair in their judgments and actions. Wisdom would guide them to make wise decisions. And propriety would ensure they conducted themselves with dignity and respect, setting a good example for the people.
So it's almost like he's describing an ideal ruler, someone who embodies these virtues and uses them to create a flourishing society.
Exactly. Mencius believed that this kind of virtuous leadership was the key to creating a stable and harmonious society. He famously argued that the people are the most important element in a state. The spirits of the land and grain are next. The sovereign is the least important. This suggests that the ruler's primary responsibility is to serve the people, not to prioritize their own power or glory.
That's a pretty radical idea for a time when rulers often saw themselves as divinely appointed or having absolute authority. It almost sounds like he's advocating for a kind of proto-democracy where the people's well-being comes first.
It's definitely a very people-centered approach to governance. And Mencius was quite explicit about the consequences of a ruler who fails to live up to these ideals. He argued that a ruler who is tyrannical and oppressive loses their mandate to rule, and the people have the right to overthrow them.
Wow. So he's not just talking about ethics in a personal sense,
Yeah.
but also linking it to the legitimacy of political power. That's a powerful connection.
It is, and it raises questions that are still relevant today. What are the qualities of a good leader? What responsibilities do those in power have to the people they govern? These are themes that resonate throughout history, and Mencius offers some timeless insights into these questions.
I'm also struck by how Mencius's emphasis on cultivation and reflection could be applied not just to individual ethical development, but also to the way we think about social and political change.
That's a great observation. Mencius believed that societies, just like individuals, have the potential for growth and transformation. He argued that if rulers cultivate virtue in themselves and create conditions that allow the people to flourish, then society as a whole will progress toward greater harmony and well-being.
So it's not just about changing laws or systems, it's about cultivating a kind of moral culture that supports ethical behavior and flourishing.
That's right. And I think this is a very hopeful and inspiring message. It suggests that we have the power to shape a better future, not just through political action, but also through the choices we make in our daily lives, by cultivating virtue in ourselves and in our communities.
Okay, so we've explored Mencius's ideas about human nature, virtue, and political philosophy. But as we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what his most enduring legacy is, especially for philosophers today. What are the key takeaways we should really grapple with?
I think Mencius offers a really compelling vision of what it means to live an ethical life. He challenges us to recognize our innate capacity for goodness, to actively cultivate our virtues through reflection and practice, and to extend our care and concern beyond ourselves to encompass our families, communities, and even the world at large.
It's a vision that emphasizes both personal responsibility and social transformation, right? We're not just isolated individuals striving for our own moral perfection. We're part of a larger web of relationships and have a role to play in creating a more just and harmonious world.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes Mencius so relevant today. His philosophy provides a framework for thinking about ethics not just in terms of rules and principles, but also in terms of cultivating dispositions, habits, and practices that allow us to live meaningful and fulfilling lives in connection with others.
It's a philosophy that speaks to both our hearts and minds, urging us to become better versions of ourselves while also working to create a better world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So if there's one thing I'd like to leave our listener with, it's this challenge from Mencius. How can you, like those ancient sages he admired, cultivate your own innate goodness and extend it outwards, contributing to a more just and compassionate world?
It's a question that resonates with a depth and urgency that transcends time and culture. So to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Mencius. May his ideas inspire you to embark on your own journey of reflection, cultivation, and extending your goodness into the world.